this, honestly.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Scott Goes podcast, and this is part 2 of the what we're calling the unofficial Alba NEC hustings. Apparently there's a Cayley going on tonight in Aberdeen, so that's why we're sort of struggling to drum up trade. But I'm delighted to have Fiona Sinclair with me, who was saying something very controversial, and I decided to start recording. And I don't think she was quite sure whether that was a good idea, but you can use your judgment as to whether you want to continue saying what you were saying or not.
Well, let's be honest. There are many things that need to be discussed about the party, and if you can't have free and open discussion, then there's no point. I'll be honest. There has to be feedback from the grassroots, and that's not happening. And where it is happening, it's quite. Well, I'm not going to say any more there because you want this for your podcast.
Well, I mean, you can expand if you wish, but be aware that it's.
Well, there's there needs to be. It's a young party, and you cannot expect to build a policy portfolio off the back of resolutions to conference and to council. You just cannot expect that. If you want to get somewhere in the short term, you have to actually develop policy in other ways.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can't have policy made undemocratically. What you have to actually do is to develop it with policy working groups, and then the summary of whatever policy they've decided will come before conference, and the party then decides on it. But the party gets the chance to see the workings behind that policy over several months. And you can have, for instance, pretty much the same kind of thing that Commonweal does, where they put together a group who discuss a particular policy field, and then they put a policy paper together and publish it, and people can read it and decide whether it's any good or not and give feedback on it. And I think that's the way to develop policy in the short term. And what we should actually be doing is essentially developing a vision of what an independent Scotland would look like. And if you don't do that, what we risk is it simply being the electoral game again, as it was with the SNP. It was the thing that drove me nuts about the SNP was, and I was only a member from 87 to 2000.
Right.
They did some excellent policy making, but they didn't have an overall vision of what an independent Scotland would look like.
Okay.
And it wasn't promoted in that way, and I feel that's how it should have been promoted. And I think that's the failing. I mean, folks talk about, well, it started off at 28% in 2012 in the polls and ended in the real poll with 45%, and that was a hell of a leap.
Yeah.
And I think that was mainly gained through people getting together and producing ideas. Okay, there was a lot of people chancing their arm, making money, and giving themselves a profile in order to get on, and thereafter becoming MPs and MSPs. But there was nonetheless quite a lot of grassroots activity where people imagined what it would be like to be in an independent Scotland. And some of the ideas were excellent. That's not to say that some of the work that was done over the decades by the SNP wasn't also excellent. It was. But it was the failure to present it in a form of a vision of what an independent Scotland could be like. That's the major problem. I was on the Environment Policy Review group of the SNP 30 years ago, and there were 3 people, and I'll just be honest, who knew what they were about, really knew what they were about, had specialist knowledge, and I was one of them. And the knowledge I had was in toxics and waste.
Okay.
The two other guys who were the main drivers of the policy were both specialists in ecology, what would now be called restoration ecology.
Right.
And in fact, at that time, they were basically ahead of the field. They were doing stuff then and thinking things then that has happened in other parts of the world since that time. So they really haven't gained the kind of recognition they should have, and their ideas. And Scotland has fallen way, way behind in those terms. So that's the shame of it all, is that politicians tend not to pay attention to people and to things that they regard as of low status, or people who are not important people. And yet it's the unimportant people who very often come up with the really important ideas and information.
So I probably should pause at this point. We didn't explain that Fiona is not actually a candidate, and you might think that you wish she was, having listened to her. But you were saying to me before we started recording that you are on the conferences committee at the moment.
Yeah. I don't expect to continue with that because I have concerns about the way that it operates. Put it that way.
Do you want to expand on that, or is that something?
If it's an open podcast going out, no, I don't.
That's fair enough. Okay.
I've already made some of my concerns known.
Okay.
And it has ruffled some feathers, put it that way. And that's not the entirety of my concerns. But I will put it down in writing and I will present it to leadership figures. And if they choose to ignore what I'm saying or anybody else is saying, then there's nothing really I can do.
So, I mean, I was talking to Neil in the earlier podcast. Is that your husband?
Yeah, he's my husband.
So, I mean, there's a lot of negativity coming from both of you, and you seem quite disillusioned, possibly to the point where Neil might not stay in the party.
Well, you can call it negativity, or you can call it disillusion. This party claims to be a member-led party, and I'm finding too much of it is led from the top.
Yeah.
There are a number of things that I have concerns about, and again, I'm not free to express them. Or I could express them, and then I'm quite sure that action would be taken against me if I did. So I'm not going to.
Did you ever consider standing for the NEC to try and?
No, because I'm a full-time carer, and there's no way I'm going to commit the time or just make that commitment. If I weren't, it would be a different matter, but I am. So
I would say to people who have thought about standing for the NEC and maybe decided against it, that it's not actually that time consuming, because you're talking about, well, if you're an ordinary member, obviously if you're a national office bearer it'd be different, but you can stand for the NEC and maybe look to one meeting a month. It's not a huge commitment of time, although I know that could be a big drawback for some people.
My main interest is in policy, and I found that a big disappointment, to be quite frank.
What policies do you find disappointing about the current?
It's the absence of policies. As I said, you've got to supercharge what policies the party has at the moment. The policies that exist we don't have a policy on agriculture. We don't have a policy on industry. Now, just they're incomplete. There are some good resolutions that have gone through conference and council, but these are very partial. They only apply to a partial element of each policy field. So you actually have to have, as I say, a full policy. Now that takes time, and that takes consideration, that takes people with specialist knowledge. I mean, there's really not much point in getting somebody who, for instance, is an electrician to make a policy on tax.
Yeah, sure.
And it's not that there seems to be confusion amongst some of the high hegians in the party about what talent they actually have, how much of it there is out there. Now, I don't know a huge number of people in the party, but I know of a number of people who have considerable amounts of knowledge, specialist knowledge, to offer.
Yeah.
And they're not really getting very far with doing that. The policy working groups have been set up are very few. It took a while for that to even happen. Some are working okay. There's only about, well, there's housing, there's transport, health is another matter entirely. Education has kind of stuttered, albeit there are discussions about that ongoing, and Neil, my husband, who's a former principal teacher, has
he said that,
involved in that. So you know, there are people who have specialist knowledge in particular areas who could develop these policies, you know. It's after 2.5 years, you really don't have the benefit of saying you're just starting up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you an idea of the kind of things that I know about. 30 years ago, I was campaigning against toxic waste.
Yeah.
And I was up in the Highlands, and I worked with, or tried to work with, the Green Party up there. And the result they got in the European elections was phenomenal. I mean, throughout Scotland, the Greens did pretty well.
Oh, was that 1989?
Though that would be, I'm trying to think. I think the Euro elections were 92, weren't they, up there?
No, it was, you know, they were on a 5-year cycle, so it was 89 and then 94. The 89 was the Green breakthrough, where they got 15% of the vote across the UK. So they probably, I don't think they did quite as well in Scotland, but
they didn't do 50%, wasn't it?
15 in the UK.
I don't remember that, but I do remember that they were getting about 6.5%, 7.5% was about the lowest they were getting. And in Lothian, because at that point Scotland was split into 8 parliamentary, 8 European regions, and in Lothian they got 10.5% of the vote. That was the highest.
I think that was 89. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure it was.
It would have been either 89 or 94.
Previously, that was the only region that they'd previously stood. And the time before, they got 1.5% of the vote. And then it went up to 10.5%. And I think Robin Harper was their candidate. I'm not sure. But in the Highlands, they had a guy called Mike Gregson, who was their candidate. And he got 9.5%. And that was from a standing start.
Yeah.
Now, they had been campaigning for about 2-3 years on a variety of things, the disposal of sewage in Inverness, because at that point Inverness's sewage just went directly out into the Moray Firth, and I'm not joking, it had absolutely no treatment whatsoever. It was known as the Filthy Firth. And they also campaigned on, well, a few things, but the principal ones were sewage, and they also campaigned about the water supply in Nairn. And Nairn has a lot of old folks. And it was round about the same time there'd been a scandal of water treatment down in the southwest of England, where a huge amount of aluminium had entered the water supply. And in Nairn, they found out that the dosing of alum, and that was insisted on by the European regulations, was way above what it should have been, and as such was representing a health hazard. And there was a guy called Roger Winter who was in the Greens, and he campaigned on this, and he just campaigned relentlessly on this one thing. And he stood for the council, and this is when the council, it was just, you got your expenses and it was first past the post. And he got in. And they've forgotten about Roger Winter, because he was their first councillor in Scotland, as far as I'm aware.
I remember that.
Certainly
I do remember that, yeah.
the first one in the Highlands.
I remember that distinctly, yeah. I was really young.
Yeah, he was a bit of a character.
Yeah.
He rubbed some people up the wrong way. He got in first past the post. So they had not just the one success, but they did have the big Euro success at 10.5%. In fact, they beat the Lib Dems. I think it was Winnie, of course, got more votes than any of the other candidates put together. And then I think next on down might have been, I don't know whether it was Labour, but Lib Dems got bumped into about 4th place by the Greens, which was quite a marker. But the funny postscript to that was that Mike Gregson got so fed up of the Greens, the Highland Greens, as they were calling themselves, that he buggered off to the Lib Dems.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah, that was entertaining, and they also were involved in the campaign that I was leading against a toxic waste incinerator right next to Inverness Airport. And they were involved with that as well. So they had quite a high profile. They were never out of the local press. I went into the radio station, Moneyfirst Radio, quite a lot. And they were fairly active on that front too. So there were ways that you could use the local media to promote your cause, and they certainly did. And the result was there for all to see, that they got a much better result in Euros, and they got a councillor elected. So it can be done, and it can be done reasonably quickly. And I just don't think that's being grasped these days. I know that the local media doesn't have the kind of importance it used to have, but it's still there, and it's still to be used, and it can reach people that you can't reach via social media. And it can also provide that kind of loop of information and communication that you can't otherwise get just with social media. Because if you have the social media and you have a website and you have something going into the local press, you can have this kind of information and communication loop which promotes your cause or your party or whatever.
Well, you said earlier, if this is supposed to be a member-led party, maybe we could talk a bit about how it could become a member-led party, because the idea that I'm pushing in my own pitch to join the NEC, or until today to stand for membership support convener, I don't know the result of that yet, but is that the entire NEC should be elected, and by the whole membership, and not just by
I agree with that, I have to say. I just don't understand. I mean, all you do is, if somebody gets elected as an office bearer, then that's it, they get elected onto the NEC via that way. If they don't get elected, then they immediately get bumped down, and you see how many votes they get for NEC. It should be simple enough to operate, as one vote for the whole of the membership, and I think that's how it should actually be. I don't know why they do it that way. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. As regards conference and having the whole membership, or anybody who wants to vote from the party membership, on resolutions, that's simply not a goer.
I think it is. I think it is.
No, well, I'll tell you why not. Because I don't know what your experience of political parties is and conference and whatnot, but as I say, mine goes back a long way. You can say
technology has changed since then.
Technology, but I mean, I actually put early on into the party the suggestion that what they should do is allow, given that we were in the middle of a pandemic, I didn't turn up to the first conference, but I put a resolution in.
Yeah.
So I had a specific reason for suggesting this, that they could have a hybrid conference, and you could have maybe not people voting, but if anybody wanted to speak on a resolution, that they could be linked up to via Zoom, whatever other thing, and you could do it that way. But actual voting, I think that's a bit tricky for resolutions, because it's done in real time, and It's how you do that. I can understand the technical difficulties with that. Plus, if you're sitting there in the conference hall, you're hearing all the arguments, and that can sway whether you vote one way or another. It really does.
Sure. I was going to say, well, the conference would be live streamed. Doing a vote online is as simple as doing it in the hall, and maybe more easy to organize, in fact. And you could say that people wouldn't necessarily be paying attention to the live stream and might be voting on something they haven't listened to, but that's the case in a real in-person conference as well. So I think we're creating problems that aren't there. The point really I'm making is that, Alba shouldn't just be almost, slightly better than the other parties. If we're starting a new party, as we effectively did only 2 years ago, we should really be blazing a trail and have genuine membership control. And the principle should be, unless there is some overriding barrier to why the members can't be in control in certain situations, then they should be in control. So they should be able to elect the entire NEC. They should be able to elect the entire conferences committee, which is not the case. The entire conferences committee is currently elected by National Council. And they should be, it's not the end of the world if my idea about the conference isn't taken up. I think the NEC thing is the more important thing. But, I really cannot see, if you live stream a conference and Alba members are watching it, I really cannot see why it's the end of the world if you allow them to vote on resolutions, because it's not technologically, the barrier is not there.
Perhaps, but it's where you put the resources and how much that would all cost. And I'm not sure whether that would be a good use of resources. I don't know. I think if you want to democratize a political party, there are many other things you could actually do to make that come about before you get to that stage. And as I say, I'm a full-time carer. Now, I can't afford time and money to go to every single conference. I've been doing as much as I can, but really, there's a limit to what I'm prepared to do in the future. And there are other people in my position. I can think of someone who's standing for the NEC, and she talks a lot about poverty, is Leanne Turvitt, and she's not exactly well off either. And if you've got to go to considerable expense and trouble to turn up at conference after conference just to try and get through a little piece of policy, it's terribly inefficient of time and effort. And what it does is give an immediate advantage to all the people who are centering their lives around this. Yeah, and I saw this happen in the SNP because, 87 to 2000, that was the time when we were out marching in Edinburgh to try and get a Scottish Parliament. I'll be perfectly honest, I've never been a devolutionist. I don't believe in devolution as a good point. In fact, Margaret MacDonald said to me that she thought devolution was a trap.
Yeah, she said that publicly.
She was right. I think she was absolutely spot on. And perhaps, at that point, I don't think I or perhaps most other people appreciated how much of a trap it's actually, it would turn out to be. And
I don't think I agree with that. But I mean, how would you have got from direct Westminster rule to independence in one go? I don't see how you could ever do that, because people would not be
how do other countries do it? Like I say, you get the representation at Westminster. That's one thing. There's Europeans as well. We had that. All we've ended up with is a professional political class. And I wrote about this in a blog for Years for Scotland, Ian Lawson's site, about the really very incestuous relationships, particularly in Scotland. And it's only happened since devolution, between the third sector, the private sector, the political classes. Failed politicians, where can they get a job? Third sector, that's one place. And where do you train up your politicians? The Labour Party, and now much more the case, the SNP, you get them in third sector. Charities is essentially what it is. And they get the opportunity to get their name in the press through press releases, and their name gets punted around, and that's one way to become a professional politician. But it's all very incestuous. And Scotland, you know, when you go, and I visited the Parliament on a number of occasions, taking part in cross-party groups, etc., and consultations, and a petition, indeed. And you get to see just how incestuous it really is. And it's not a pretty sight, to be quite frank. And it's very hard to, well, it's virtually impossible to break into that unless you are employed by a third sector organisation, if you're a campaigner, because you just can't get anywhere. You're not listened to, you're not taken seriously. And the politicians, they want to have they want to limit the access that people have to them. In some ways you could understand that because they only have so many hours in the day, but in another way, all they're doing is seeing the groups who have particular, you know, specific self-interests. In the case of something like the National Autistic Society, they run, I don't know if they still run it, but I'm fairly sure they do, an accreditation scheme, a training scheme that, you know, get a certificate, do the training. It was largely self-assessment. I don't think it's changed. And they get a wee ticket to say, oh yes, we're part of the NES's accreditation scheme. Now, as I pointed out, what would be far better, far more efficient and far fairer is if you actually have national standards for autism services, but there aren't any. Okay. And there's a basic problem with that kind of thing. I was really pretty scunnered when the SNP first got into government, and Alex Salmond, within, I think it was the first week of them getting in, handed over £200,000 to Scottish Autism. It used to be called the Scottish Society for Autism. And that was for as far as I remember, I think that was what was it they called it? A mapping exercise, which was to map all the services for autism in Scotland. And I was pretty incensed, as were other people, because there had already been a mapping exercise by the National Autistic Society. And we thought that was pretty dreadful. All they needed to do, all anybody needed to do, was to go to the cross-party group and, you know, local groups and say, what are the services in your area? And we would have been desperate to tell the politicians what there was available, and they wouldn't have had to pay a penny, because we would have just told them, big fat zero. But they spent, you know, huge amounts of money. And now that £200,000 could have been used to set up, for instance, a teacher training course. But instead it goes into something that's already been done and being done badly. And we never heard, you know, what actually came out from that. But it's repeatedly, over and over again, that kind of thing happens. Loads of other things that could go into. But that's why I wanted the Alba party to be something that actually not just listened to members, but actually took on board what they're saying and what their life experience is. I'm not interested in just hand clapping or being part of some tribalistic group that says, oh, aren't the leaders great? No, not interested, not in the least. And I think you're going to find an awful lot of people in Scotland are in the same, have the same position, have the same attitude. What you've got to do is actually to reach out to people, and you can do that through your own membership. If you choose to go and speak to the charities, the businesses, and you cut out your own membership who have that, you know, wider experience, more detailed experience, then you're not going to improve matters. Scotland has some terrible problems. I could point you to a range of people in who write blogs, for instance, who you could usefully interview, who would give you an idea of the problems within a particular field of activity in Scotland, whether it's the legal system, There's a guy called Peter Cherby who has a blog called the Scottish Law Reporter, who writes about some of the anomalies of the legal system in Scotland. And it's actually the longest running petition in the Scottish Parliament.
Okay.
He put in a petition asking for a register of judges' interests. It's been running for over 10 years.
Can I just jump in? We've got somebody called Adam Smith here. I just want to check whether Adam Smith is a genuine person. I did let him in. I mean, I've been ignoring most of the. There we go. That's not a normal person, right? Okay, so I got rid of him. I knew
you live in Hope.
I knew it was. I just thought Adam Smith. It sounded like it potentially could have been a Scottish name, but no.
It's an economist from Kirkcaldy.
Yeah, exactly. Very naive of me, but who knows? Well, we did have 5 people earlier.
It can happen. Let's be honest. It can happen. And so there's the Scottish Law Reporter blog, and then there's the Parks Watch blog. And that's run by a guy called Nick Kemper. I hope I've pronounced his name correctly. And he's been writing some particularly excellent blogs lately. He focuses on the national parks in Scotland, but what he's been writing about is landslips. And you think, oh, landslips, that kind of very specific thing. But actually, when you think of the fact that the current proposal is to spend £470 million. That's nearly £500 million on a shelter, not a tunnel, a shelter, a bit like the one you have near Strome, I think it is up by Loch Carron. It's a kind of shelter thing that goes over the road and the railway to protect against rockfalls. And they're proposing that for the rest and be thankful.
Yeah. That's
and £470 million on that. And he's pointed out, and he's got a lot of people that he's in touch with who know about these things, that this is a ludicrous amount of money and it's not going to work. And if you read about that particular part of the country, that whole hillside, that mountain, has got alluvial soil on it, and it's all just going to come down at one point. Now, on the continent of Europe, they don't just build a shelter or a tunnel or whatever else. If they're doing a road in a mountainous area, what they do is they plant up with trees. And I think it is still the case that sheep are being grazed on that hillside. It certainly wasn't until quite recently, which is nuts. It's absolutely nuts. Because grazing and muir burn are the things that destroy the soil, stop the soil holding together. And what they actually need to do is take the animals off that are grazing it, for one. Probably going to have to plant some trees just to get things done fast. It's not done quickly. And then, as part of the whole thing, look at the civil engineering that they're going to have to do. I'm not sure whether it's a savable situation anymore, to be honest, because it's been going on so long, and now the rainfall that they're getting in that area is getting worse and worse. So he's a really interesting guy to get hold of, because if you think of all the roads in Scotland and the railways, because the Stonehaven incident happened because there was a landslip there as well, the amount of money that is going to have to spent to mitigate all of the landslip problems, let alone anything else, is huge.
Yeah. And
they're just not thinking things through. I mean, Carlock Wall on the A77, I think it was. Yeah, A77. Apparently, somebody chopped down some trees there and the road collapsed. And they've spent over 8 million building a support to support the road there. 8 million quid. So you're talking of considerable sums of money. So there we are. Scottish Law Reporter Peter Cherby. Get hold of him and get him talking. I'm not sure that he's an independentista. I think he might be a unionist, but he writes a very good blog. And Nick Kemper of Parks Watch, and another chap you might want to speak to, again, about Scotland's problems and how you could actually sort them, is a guy called Dr. Peter Gordon.
Okay.
And he writes a blog as well, and it's about mental health. He retired as a psychiatrist because basically he couldn't stick the way that they were treating people in Scotland and all the things that were being done and just not recognised, the overuse of drugs in particular. And he was a psychiatrist of old age. We used to call it geriatrics, but that's what they call it now. Very interesting guy, very cultured. He writes about various things, but he campaigned via petition for a Sunshine Act for Scotland. Now, the Sunshine Act in the States was about getting a register of commercial interests of doctors. There is a voluntary register in health boards in Scotland, but basically it's mostly ignored. The doctors and other healthcare decision makers don't tend to register in their interests. Now, you can see not every doctor has, is taking kickbacks from the pharmaceutical industry or whatever, but there are key people who make decisions, and we don't know what their commercial interests are. So his petition for a Sunshine Act for Scotland was to have such an act and to make it mandatory for all healthcare decision makers to sign a public register of their commercial interests, because it does make a difference. And when, the former head of the NHS in Scotland is saying that we can't continue without some level of privatisation of the health service in Scotland, then you should be paying attention to people like Dr. Peter Gordon, because he can point out where you can genuinely save money without privatisation.
Right. I think this is what is called an open loop, where there was something I meant to say about 20 or 30 minutes ago before the subject moved on massive. It was when you were talking about, well, what do other countries do to get to independence if they don't go in a single jump from direct rule from the central state? I just wanted to make the point that actually most countries that become independent have some kind of layer of self-government before they become independent. Not always.
Well, that actually runs counter to what Margaret MacDonald said, and she said that actually very few countries have.
I think Margaret MacDonald was wrong. I mean, you think about most British colonies that became independent. Most of them had some form of semi-autonomous government. Rhodesia, before it declared unilateral independence, that was largely running its own affairs. Most colonies. I suppose Ireland.
That's really not a good one to choose, because
every colony, let's put it that way.
I mean, Rhodesia had the white minority rule, and the question is, would it have had? It declared UDI anyway. So
exactly. I was just making the point that before it declared UDI, it was running itself, and that was actually the white population was running itself.
The majority, yeah.
But I was just making the point that before that, so it was running itself. But actually, most British colonies were doing that. I was going to make the point that the big exception was probably Ireland, because that was in the same situation that Scotland was in before 1999, with direct rule from London, and they did become.
That's looking at it from the point of view of the British Empire.
Well, I was going to say
there are other countries, of course, which have become independent through other means. I mean, the Scandinavian countries are a case in point, and you've also got Finland, which, the thing is, Europe's changed so much down the centuries. Finland was part of the Tsarist Empire.
Sure.
And you've got actually, Finland's a really good example, because you got a cultural reawakening. Their composer Sibelius was part of that cultural reawakening, which led to Finnish independence. They became independent, I think, in 1917, but then they kind of I don't want to sort of go in too far into Finnish independence, but they had the invasion by both the Nazis and the Soviet Union. And
well, Finland's a really interesting country because they were allies with Nazi Germany. They were co-belligerents with Nazi Germany for most of the Second World War, and then they had a kind of limited defense pact with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and there was the word Finlandization, which was, you know, the idea of essentially a Western country that's self-censored and, you know, it's, you know, held back from criticizing the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, they basically got invaded by the Soviet Union. They had to fight them, but my God, they put up a hell of a fight. But that's what led to the pact.
They were able to, unlike any other country in Eastern Europe, they were able to negotiate a settlement with the Soviet Union to avoid being effectively occupied and, you know, to be made a communist country against the will.
And they once the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe was freed up, as it were, then the Finnish economy was in a bit of trouble because they were very dependent on timber. And Nokia, of course, was the thing that came to the fore, and Finnish education. So they made it that way, and they've developed ever since. And now, what the healthiest, happiest, best educated nation almost on the planet, certainly within Europe.
I mean, essentially, they were on the wrong side in the Second World War. Effectively, they were, you know, allied, semi-allied to the wrong side during the Cold War, and yet there's been this kind of through train where they didn't lose the political system.
They had to do that big change because they were economically struggling, and it was because they had such a close tie to the Soviet Union.
I was just going to make the point that what's unusual about Finland is that, unlike any other country that has been in a defeated position, they somehow come out without their political system being changed or without the state collapsing, which is quite an unusual and interesting phenomenon.
Not so sure. As I say, I don't know a huge amount. I've read stuff down the years about Finland. The thing that I know most about with Finland is that they have, in their promotion of health, because the Finns had just about the worst health in Europe, as bad as the Scots.
Well, that's bad.
Yeah, and they decided to really do something about it. And they decided that Finnish farmers would have to grow more fruit and veg. And the farmers pointed out, well, you know, we're just not going to be able to do that here. So they concentrated on soft fruits and berry fruits, and specifically the fruits that grow in the forests in Finland. And they've made a big thing about that and drastically improved their health, because the point the farmers made was, if you want fruit, you're going to have to look at the things you can grow here, otherwise you're going to be importing a hell of a lot of food. And if you want a particularly interesting video experience, go onto YouTube and look at the cycle paths that they have in the city of Oulu in Finland, which is in the Arctic Circle.
Okay.
They cycle in the winter on snow, and it's just getting people active and getting them a good diet, a good education, and, you know, that's it. And in contrast, in Scotland, we now have 1 in 4 adults on antidepressants. So that's it. That's the difference. Is actually planning, is actually thinking of what you want your society to be. Talking of independence, you've got Norway. They decided they wanted to separate from Sweden in 1920, and they did an amicable separation. Likewise, the velvet divorce between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. There are precedents, but none really, like, it's not the only real I think the close example would be Ireland, because, yeah, you know, we have such a close relationship with Ireland, and it's this difference between a very heavily populated country and a quite, low population for a country, which Scotland has. Wasn't always like that. It was, Scotland had a fifth of the population of England at the Treaty of Union.
Yeah,
it's just steadily worse. So yeah, these comparisons, they're not all perfect, but you can learn something from each of them.
Okay, so we've been talking for about an hour, and this has been billed as an Alba NEC hustings, and you're not actually a candidate.
I mean, you can't have that. That's the thing. There's nobody here from the NEC, and I did ask the General Secretary to host the hustings, and really we waited to see whether anything was going to happen, and really shouldn't have waited. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to ask because I don't know whether anybody else has. And he decided it wasn't necessary. Now, I think that's horrendous. I think there should be.
Well, we had an unofficial hustings. We had an unofficial hustings in the afternoon, which Neil took part in, and it wasn't just me; it was Trish McPherson as well. So we had two candidates for the NEC.
Yeah, that's not good enough, and we know.
I'm not saying it is good enough, but
you're trying to do something.
Well, yeah, we're trying to do something, and we succeeded to some extent. But anyway, I just thought before we wrap this up, if we could at least talk about what the new NEC, which will be elected over the weekend, what the new NEC's priorities should be. Where would you like to see changes? What would you like to see the candidates prioritizing? If you want it to be a member-led party, how do we do that?
Well, what I don't think NEC candidates should do is say that they're going to base policy on data, because I'll tell you this much: they've been basing policies in the Scottish government on data for well over a decade. There've been data sharing arrangements under GERFEC and the like, and they've been doing that. And really, it depends what data you gather and where you gather that data from. So it's a meaningless statement. It's just drivel. What you actually need to do is to talk to your ordinary members and get them to contribute to policy. There's lots of talent out there, and get them to feed through in it. So please, less of the stuff about data-driven policy. It's garbage. It really is garbage. It's been done. It's nothing new. It's garbage in, garbage out, in data terms. I can tell you, for instance, that I put in an FOI, just to divert for a second. I put in a Freedom of Information request to the Mental Welfare Commission, asking them how many people died in the mental health system in Scotland. That was a decade ago. And they had never actually totted up how many people died. That's died as opposed to suicide, which should be categorized separately. They don't have separate statistics for that either. But they basically pissed me off because I asked another series of FOI questions and said, okay, you're in danger of being a vexatious questioner. So I thought, okay, what is there missing in their reports? Because it all looked a lot of flannel to me. So I put in the FOI request, and it turned out what happened was they gave me the number, and it was 78 people had died in one particular year, but that should be counted every single year. It's not. And they produced a report, but they failed to tell me they'd done this, and they called it Death in Detention. It was published in 2013. That's an example of non-data driven policy, because if you actually understand that the number of deaths in a system where people are compulsorily treated and held is a key marker of human rights, then you should be doing that. And they weren't, and they're still not doing it. So it's another of the things that are wrong with Scotland. But oh dear, I've diverted a bit too far and I've forgotten what the question was.
What should the priorities be for the new
They should what they should basically prioritize is talking to their members and getting their feedback from their members. Too often we're sitting there and listening to what has been decided from on high. And if you want to actually move things forward and move them forward fast and effectively, get your membership involved, find out where their talents lie, even if it's somebody at local level who knows their local community well, knows people, knows what's going on, and knows what's happening and what's not happening, what the council are doing that's effective, what's not effective, and can forewarn you of something coming up that might hit the press or might be coming up at council. Just something like that. Or you've got somebody who is, for instance, a tax inspector who can advise you on tax policy. Or you've got somebody who's a teacher who can help you, or, you know, it might be involved with a union, for instance, who can help you to write education policy. Or you've got somebody who's a nurse who can tell you what's going on in the front line, in the health service, in their area, and contribute to health policy. Now, there are people like that in Alba, and some of them are contributing to policy, but it's pretty piecemeal. If you want to present a vision to people of Scotland, and don't assume that because the poll currently says 54% want independence, that necessarily will translate to a vote for independence parties of that. It ain't going to happen. I'm just telling you now, for years, people were in support of independence for Scotland, but they didn't vote SNP. Sometimes they did. I mean, I think George Leslie, it was shortly before Winnie won in Hamilton, got 28% of the vote in Pollock, which is dead on the nail with the 2012 polls, 28%. There were over 800,000 people voted for the SNP in October 1974. So this idea that the people of Scotland have only recently taken up the idea of independence is nonsense. The campaigning back in 1974 was really effective by the SNP. It could have been better, but it was pretty effective, the oil campaign, because you could look around you and see that there were things that Scotland was missing out on that were available elsewhere. And we really weren't getting a fair crack of the whip. So there are lots of things you should do. Involve your members. And I was disappointed for the local elections that there was no use whatsoever made of the local media. God knows I tried to get things going locally, and that's another story. But you really do need to get stuff into the local media. You may hate their guts, you may think they're utterly useless, but you should still be trying.
Yeah. Because
they can be used. So there's lots of stuff to do. I think there should start to be organisation now on a parliamentary region basis. I think we should be getting candidates in place very soon for Westminster. Obviously, something they're looking at. They're looking at that. But you cannot do that. You cannot do that if you don't even have an agriculture policy. And at present, the party doesn't have an agriculture policy. There is nothing there, nothing at all. Other policies are not there in total. It does come back to that, because you've got to say, what is your party about? Not just independence, because as I say, people in Scotland, the vote on independence has come and gone, and you can have people in favour of independence, but they're not going to vote. They didn't vote for the SNP for one reason or another, and it isn't necessarily going to come Alpa's way. It really isn't. Don't delude, just don't delude yourselves. It's necessarily going to come here. You actually have to show that you are viable, that you have good ideas, and that you're not just another bunch of opportunists, because people's idea of the SNP has taken a big hit. not far down the road from where I live, there was a riot in Alba in East Ayrshire. Now, we don't know the full facts about what happened there. We may never know the full facts about what happened there, but it's very, very clear that things are stirring and people are getting really, really sick of what's going on. And I think politicians sometimes play with fire, and they should be very careful about how things are handled. You need to know what you're doing, and you've got to have good quality candidates, but you've also got to have people, and this is the lesson of the SNP, who believe, who really have conviction, and who have that background, rather than somebody who's just decided this would be a nice gig for them and they'll gain from it. They've got to have that background. And I can think of one MP who was given a gig as an MP, as a candidate to be an MP, and they hadn't been in the SNP for even a year. I think probably only 6 months. That's appalling. You cannot have people standing for internal election or external election in a political party who have just walked in the door. That's just not acceptable.
Well,
because you don't know what they're doing.
I think people should be able to stand for internal elections as soon as they join. I don't think that's unreasonable, because as members you do have that. You do have that right.
But if you've got people who have only just joined, they may be utterly convinced that Scotland should be independent, but we should at least have a hustings as members where we can ask them questions. So if you don't have that hustings, you can't, making a leap of faith on someone without any questioning, let alone, that's hopeless.
Well, I am standing for the NEC, and you've been speaking. You haven't asked me a question. Let me at least put forward a couple of points. I've completely lost my train of thought. Oh yes, I know what it was. In terms of how the NEC could change, one very simple thing it could do would be to publicise its activities. When I was on the NEC for a year, we were always told about confidentiality. And I remember I went to one of the LACU meetings, the first LACU meetings, and I was asked, is there any news from the NEC? It's been very quiet. And I said, well, I've kind of been told I'm not allowed to say. And when this was raised at the NEC, we were told that, well, we are revealing what happens in the weekly video, which, as far as I can remember, it was just kind of, well, a meeting took place and it was a really positive meeting. I think, if you elect the ruling body of a party, you've got to be a bit more transparent in that. Obviously, there has to be rules so that there can be a free and frank exchange of views without people being
I would quite frankly just settle for NEC members being able to contact them.
Okay, sure.
Directly, and office bearers as well, and that just hasn't been possible.
The other point I want to make before we wrap up, and this will hopefully reveal that I am here for the right reasons and not as a sort of career, because this may not be a popular view with some people, is that I think that the candidates for the Westminster general election, I'm not sure there should be that many candidates. I think we should focus all our resources, concentrate all our resources on trying to get Neil Hanvey and Kenny McCaskill re-elected, or at least to get them as good a result as possible. And if you put too many candidates up, you're simply going to detract from that. And it's going to be self-destructive, because if you get sort of a derisory vote in some of those other constituencies, but that derisory vote is enough to cost the SNP the seat, you can create a sort of mythology of Alba as Labour's little helpers. And I think what we've got to do is create a springboard for the much more important 2026 Holyrood election, when we can use the proportional representation system to win a number of seats. So we must make sure that we we don't do anything harmful to ourselves, to the independence cause, but if we concentrate our resources in those two seats, Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, and in East Lothian, and also to try and help Angus MacNeil in the Western Isles, then if we can get some really good results there, then that would be a step forward, would build Alba's profile, and hopefully get us in a good
position for the 2026
Holyrood election.
Yeah, I think you can focus too much on the electoral calculus and who you reckon you're going to get elected. I think you've got to focus on how you're going to persuade people to vote for you. You need to make yourselves known, and the question is, how do you make yourselves known? If you just talk about independence all the time and don't say what kind of independence you're wanting, I mean, it's just, oh, it's independence. Okay, so what's your brand of independence? How does that differ from the SNP? Are you just sort of, tag along to the SNP? Isn't really going to persuade people to vote for you. It just isn't. And the SNP's lost an awful lot of electoral ground. So how do you actually persuade people who don't want to vote for the SNP, who maybe voted for them previously, that the Alba party is the party that they should vote for? You've actually got to have a public platform. Now, there's a number of things that the Alba party has promoted successfully. They haven't got much in the way of reward for it right now, but you've got to build on that and get those votes coming in. I think we're all kind of swithering as to whether we should go for the minimum of 12 to get the PPBs or more than that. I mean, if you get the 12 candidates, you get the party political broadcasts, and I think that's something that they have to do, and they've already decided that's what it's going to be. But it's how much more you do. I also think it depends on what seats you're going to target and who the actual candidates are. There's no point in having candidates that you can't support, and you've got to decide where best to put your resources, and you have to get those resources in place. And it's all a thing of you build through persuading people that you're a credible party, and then they feel like supporting you electorally or financially or however else. It's the building of that is not nearly as good as it could and it should be. And that's what the party actually has to do. I'm in no doubts about it. Yes, I think that the East Lothian and the Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, is it Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath?
Yeah.
Or have I got that wrong? It is Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath. Yeah. Are important to hold on to. But you're not going to take away from the potential success of holding those constituencies if you go for more than those. In fact, you could help get those two MPs elected if you've got the right policies in place, if you've got the right strategy. And
well, sure, but I mean, I think the principle still holds that if you spread your resources too thinly, you're going to detract from. And I'm slightly concerned about the idea that we would choose the number of constituencies we put up candidates in just to get like what would it be, a 3-minute party election broadcast? It's not the fact that the idea that should be the decisive consideration, I think, is odd.
I don't agree with you at all there. I think that's necessary, because that's how you're going to get across to people. It will be on YouTube. It will be on
get something on YouTube without having an official party election broadcast.
Yeah, but you can that will give you
well, I mean, I think it's desirable to have a party election broadcast, but I'm just saying that if that's the driver of a really important decision about how many candidates you put up, I'm not sure that's the correct way of going about it.
I don't think it's the only driver.
Okay,
but it's an important one. And as I say, I think if you just go for let's say 3 or 4 constituencies, it's not exactly saying you're an ambitious party, is it? It's not exactly saying that you are going to get anywhere in 26. You don't have any apparent self-belief if you just go for.
No, I don't agree with that. I think the self-belief that comes from choosing your battles and knowing that you're going to get the best result by choosing those battles carefully. And for a small party, the opportunity really does lie with proportional representation elections. We have 3 tiers of government in Scotland. We have the local councils, we have Westminster, we have Holyrood. 2 of those 3 are elected by proportional representation, so we can go for broke in those.
Yeah, but as I pointed out to you, James, if the Green Party, and believe you me, they didn't do any leafleting, they didn't do any canvassing, all they did was put stuff into the local media, the local press in particular, and they managed to get 9.5% of the vote from a standing start in a first past the post election. Anybody who says that that's impossible doesn't know. They really don't know. And that's one example, and I'm sure there are many others out there, but that's one I know about and one I witnessed. It's entirely possible. If you got, let's just say, 9-10% of the vote, that was what they were predicting for the Greens. In fact, I think they were predicting initially 12%, which of course they didn't get for the last Holyrood election. Now they ended up with how many MSPs have they got now? Is it 8?
Yeah, one of them's presiding officer. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember what percentage of the vote they actually got. It depends whether you're talking of constituency or the regional vote. But they haven't really progressed since 30 years ago. And that's because, I think they disappeared. The opportunity disappeared. And really, that comes back to another thing. And okay, I'm somebody who's very knowledgeable and keen about all things environmental. What you've got to be careful of, particularly in this day and age, and it's not just about climate change, because there are 3 crises that are interwoven in terms of the environment. One is biodiversity, one is pollution, and the other one is climate change, and they all act on each other. If you do not have a good prominent environment campaign in this day and age, if you're even worse, seen to be anti-environment, you can kiss goodbye to thousands of votes that you would otherwise get if you knew what you're about and you change your position, shall I put it that way. There are lots of votes to be picked up. A lot of people left the Greens because they were disenchanted with what was going on, and they were committed environmentalists. A lot of voters are going to see right through them, and I really strongly resent this kind of anti-environment stance where anything to do with the environment is laughed about purely because the Green Party are such a bunch of, well, should we say, chancers and idiots. They would dispute that, of course, but I think their performance in the Scottish Parliament kind of, bears witness to that.
Let me try.
You really have to go for the environment vote as well.
I want to go back to what you said about the Green Party 30 years ago, where you were using that as a sort of example of how Alba could use the general election to make progress. I don't agree that as a sort of historical point, I don't agree that the Greens did that by blitzing the local press. They may have blitzed the local press, but what happened in 1989 was, well, it was a low turnout, as there always is in European, as there always was in European elections. We don't have them anymore. And the Liberal Democrats had just imploded, and there was this space, and there was environmental concern about greenhouse gases, the ozone layer that peaked in around about 1989. And it was largely a national vote, and they got 15% of the vote in the UK, and they did less well than that in Scotland. So that, you know, they were sort of piggybacking on what was going on UK wide. But it was in those days, of course, as we said earlier, European elections were fought by first past the post, and what did the Greens really achieve with that 15%? It sort of largely disappeared. They came back, you know, less successful later, but, you know, with a better core vote. But I'm not sure that, you know, it's okay in European elections because the results don't matter. But in Westminster elections, if you mess about and, you know, you cost the SNP a few seats here and there, even just one or two, I think that's damaging not only to the independence movement, but it's also damaging to Alba.
You're not going to be surprised. I'm going to disagree with you there. I think that the SNP is losing, and we saw with Rutherglen.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, the SNP are staring down the barrel of
support. People who will not go out and vote for them anymore.
Well, sure, but I mean,
do you pick up those votes, or do you just say to people, well, we won't actually attempt to represent you? We will say if you don't vote for the SNP, we're not going to pick up your votes. That's a bit daft. There are genuinely a lot of people who are just not going to vote for the SNP. So do you go after their votes? Of course you do.
Well, we were talking earlier in the previous hustings, which was more of a genuine hustings, about the recording Cowdenbeath, about East Lothian, and about the Western Isles, and about how the SNP should not stand there. And, you know, we were talking about how the SNP should put ego to one side, should put emotion to one side, should put all the acrimony of the split with Alba to one side, and think really calmly and carefully about the consequences of putting up candidates in those seats, particularly in the Western Isles. And, you know, it would be obviously a terrible mistake for the SNP to put up a candidate in the Western Isles, because it could help Labour win that seat, and we might never, you know, the independence parties collectively might never get that seat back, because once, you know, Western Isles is very personality driven, and once you get somebody installed, it's very difficult to dislodge them. So if we're saying to the SNP, please be sensible, please think about this calmly and rationally about whether you should put up candidates in these seats, I think we've got to do the same. But it's not about, you know, diminishing our own prospects, because if we concentrate our resources in those 2 or 3 seats, we're going to do better in those 2 or 3 seats, and that's where it really matters. You know, it's much better to get, well, I don't know how realistically well we can do in those 2 or 3 seats, but even if it's 15% of the vote, hopefully if it's 35%, hopefully it's winning. But that will have a much greater impact than, you know, 3% or 2% or 1% spread out across the country.
Like I say, I think that's not taking into account that if you stand in a number of seats, you present yourself as a credible party. That's if you can. You've got to have the financial resources, and you've got to have the human resources, and you've got to have the policy platform.
It's a how long is a piece of string question, though, isn't it? Because if people would say, well, you're only standing in 12, you're not a serious party. You're only standing 22, you're not a serious party. You know, some people think we should be standing in every single constituency. So
I mean, I just think that in some ways the SNP is a busted flush. Now, obviously, a lot of other people don't agree with that. There may be some who come through who are going to take it eventually in a different direction, but at the moment, I don't think it's very hopeful. And I don't think that we should be relying on a party that, let's face it, most of the people in the Alba party have left order to form, in order to form Alba. Not me. I mean, I left the SNP a long time ago. So,
but isn't this a council of despair in a way? Because unless we're really saying that we expect Alba to actually win seats out of nowhere, then we're effectively abandoning it to the Labour Party, and we're effectively, I mean, isn't it the absolute priority to stop Labour becoming the dominant party in Scotland in Westminster terms? Isn't that the first priority rather than, I mean, we've pushed.
Well, it's how do you do that? I mean, there's one thing that actually Alba could have done, and that was really hammered all of this stuff about the, as they call it, the gender woo. Because the Labour Party has been promoting it as well. In fact, the only ones who haven't, they've, I believe, have played it quite a smart double game in it, are the Tories. Because you get some Tories who will support self-ID and others who don't. And I think they're playing a bit of a double game.
Wasn't there a danger that we become so fixated with the gender? And I thought a few months ago.
No, I don't think it should. I think as a man, you probably are seeing it as a fixation. As a woman, I don't see it as a fixation, because if you actually think about it and really think about it, and well, quite apart from the fact that women are over half the population, and you're saying to them, "Oh, you're not important. Your rights and your views are not important." Let's think of it this way. Let's think of it. Yeah, but let's think of it this way.
I share your view. I'm just saying that we can't become.
But just let's think of it in terms of reality. I could hold up these fingers and say, how many fingers am I holding up? And I could say Winston. Would you get the idea then? Because once you can compel somebody to say something, to agree with something, you are on a very slippery slope. And it doesn't matter whether it's the number of fingers you're holding up. And of course, I'm quoting from 1984. I mean, or saying a man has a penis. It doesn't matter. Essentially, that's what you're doing. It's a very, very slippery slope. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And I think that the Alba Party could have made much greater headway had we looked at very seriously at what all of this represents. And I think there's been a failure of imagination and of intellectual
I think
examination.
On this point, I would really have to disagree with you, because the Alba Party has become so associated with this issue that it's almost greater than the association between the Alba Party and independents.
No, I don't.
I
really
cannot
don't
accept the idea that the Alba Party has fallen short of prioritising this issue. It's been extraordinarily prioritised.
No, well, a lot of women feel no, it hasn't been.
Even by the Alba Party, which is, people like Denise Findlay and Yvonne Ridley, really key people are. Really?
Okay, so the first women's convener was Carolyn McAllister.
Sure.
And she was excellent on that, and she's continued with that.
Yvonne Ridley is really strong on the gender issue.
Is she?
Oh yes, she is. I mean, I follow her on social media. She is really, really trenchant on that issue. Yeah,
well, good for her. But the party as a whole, and I mean, I've had correspondence with Yvonne, and yeah, she's picked up on things that haven't been done. So that's good, but really, it hasn't moved forward on that. And I think with the schools, you've now got really serious ingrained problems coming through. You've got a whole generation of children who are being propagandized to. And that has an effect. I don't want to go on about it, but I think it's deserving of discussion, and there are a lot of men who get what this is about.
I get what it's about. I can assure you of that.
I'll be honest, James. I think there are some things that you perhaps are missing, but yes, you do seem to get some of it.
Thank you.
All right. But it's what could have actually been done in terms of campaigning. is a bit disappointing, because, as I say, this is where not only you could hammer the SNP, but also the Labour Party. They've been all over the place on this. They really have been. And the Lib Dems, well, they're even worse. So, and yeah, the Greens, I mean, well,
what percentage?
that's it. It's about where, you know, what is reality and what is just nonsense.
Isn't there a danger of thinking that because some women feel strongly about this, that is replicated among women in the voting public? Because I cannot see the evidence that this is a high priority. Most people agree, and I've run I'm someone who has actually commissioned a poll, an extensive poll on this subject, and yes, no question, the majority of the public agree with your stance. But is that the issue that will determine their votes? I'm not convinced it is. And if you become pigeonholed as an identity politics party, and this is a problem for both the SNP and Alba in opposite directions, then you can start to look a little bit
this isn't
from the real priorities of the
this is the against identity politics, and it's about reality.
Yeah, but it's about yeah, sure. I mean, absolutely, but it's nevertheless fixating on that issue, which is not really a high priority for the public.
Well, I think there's much more could have been done in the local elections on it, and that was what I was trying to push for.
I saw leaflets that mentioned it quite prominently. It's been a big issue for Alba. I'm just sort of struggling with the idea that, you know, the question is, should it have been that strong, or should it have been a bit less? I can't really imagine how it could have been any greater, because there was a time when I was really concerned that we were becoming totally associated with this issue to the exclusion of everything else. Certainly on social media, it was like that was all that anybody ever wanted to talk about.
Well, it's not all that I want to talk about, as you know.
Yeah.
And there are other things, but it's working out what you should be doing in any given area, and trying to present yourself as a thinking party that cares, and that is actually producing good policy that will persuade people that you've actually got some substance to you. You've got to have credibility, and that comes through a variety of ways, and policy is certainly key to that. So you've got to actually say, well, what are you going to do? And we could talk around this for a long time, and we don't have all of that time. But there are certainly gaps that need to be dealt with, and there's certainly much more listening and acting on that listening that needs to happen. People should not be dismissed because they are not politically ambitious, or because they want to engage in one thing rather than another. You just say, okay, that's what you want to do. Let's make it possible for you to do it, and work with that. You know, there's a lot of pressure for people to go out and do leafleting. I certainly found that, and I'm not going to do that. I don't have time, and I don't have opportunities, so that's it. Which reminds me, I really need to go now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was going to say, we've been talking for about an hour and a half, so I think this is a good moment to wrap things up. So thanks very much, Fiona.
But if you want to have a chat, an honest chat, without recording things, I'm here.
Okay, that's great. I may well take you up on that. You sent me an email the other day, didn't you? I won't reveal the contents of that email, but I think you
don't.
No, I won't. I was just trying to remember whether it was
okay. Because I mean, quite frankly, I never put anything in writing that I would not say to someone's face.
Are you sure that was the case this time?
Yes, actually. Right. Yeah. I've said that and more.
Okay.
And I'm perfectly willing to do that, but not in public.
Sure.
Now, we have had candidates for NEC in particular who have put stuff out that's been internal to the party, and I don't think they should have done it. I'm most disappointed that they have done that. Now, any criticisms, generally speaking, until I started speaking to you, and I think you need to edit down what you're doing for your podcast. Any criticisms I've made privately to other Alba members and discussed things with them. I haven't taken to Twitter. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. So haven't taken to either of these to say, oh, the party's not doing this, that, or the other thing, or this, that, or the next thing is wrong. It's trying to find people who have the time and who are willing to listen to what you say. The other thing is that I find it really it is irksome that you've got folks who have, I'll just say it, bugger all political experience, whether party political or in any other respect, sitting there telling you stuff and you think, aye, okay, so that's what you think. It's very annoying, and they really don't have a handle on stuff, and they don't have the memory of things that have happened in the past. And I'm quite willing to listen to what others have to say, but if they've haven't got an O grade to their name, and they're telling you that leafleting's the way to go, nope.
Well, O grades are going back quite a way. So,
or standard grades or whatever the hell.
Something even that's replaced standard grades. But anyway, we better wrap things
nationals up. That's it. The national 4s and 5s and whatnot. Yeah. It's that's another topic. You should get people on to talk about Scottish education. Get a good going discussion about that, because really, it's in dire straits. Heather McLean's an obvious one.
Okay.
There are other people, so that's that.
I tried to contact Heather McLean to ask her to do this, but it's hard to get in touch with her.
What you need to do is a series of interviews on various policy fields and find out what it is that's going wrong in Scotland at the moment and what we could do to make things better, because that actually I think would be very appealing for a lot of people. And it's not just if it's not all about independence, if we can actually show that independence will make things better, because there are people who are really thinking about what the problems are, and they're really thinking about how to resolve those problems, how to make things a lot better. You come back to the example of Finland, for instance, and what they've managed to do. Scotland has an awful lot going for it, and we could make things a lot better. And there's also, speak to some of the local campaigners. Sally Hughes in Perth, she's campaigning against the Taymouth Castle development. And I was giving her a few tips about something she might do with that. So there's all sorts of folks that you could get hold of and do an interesting programme, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 about, and actually show there are things to do. But my bottom line is, for this election, there should have been a hustings.
Oh yeah.
And there's the NEC candidates actually need to start listening to people who are out with their own wee circles, dare I say it, cliques, and then they might actually learn more. Okay,
right. So just to finish this up, you may not have totally got this impression from this podcast, but Fiona is not standing for the NEC, but I am.
Nope.
And I would urge people, because voting is very close now, if you want to democratise the party, if that's your priority, if you want the NEC to be totally elected, if you want the other national committees to be totally elected, and if you want all members to have a say on conference resolutions, regardless of whether they're in the hall or not, then one way you can express that view is to vote for me, and I would be really grateful if you would do so. If you have a vote, which is of course the whole point I'm making, which is because not all Alba members will actually have a vote, but if you do have a vote, then please help other members get that vote and vote for me if you feel able to do so. And that is the end of this very special edition of the Scott Goes podcast. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you later.